They told you slavery in the Americas was a story of cotton fields in the North. Forget everything you learned about slavery starting in 1619. Our story begins earlier, on Latin soil, with sugar, steel, and black rebellions that terrified empires. This time the Americas are seen from our side. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Picture the Atlantic at night. The water is black glass. The sky is a bowl of stars. Somewhere between the coast of Africa and the shores of Brazil, a creaking ship cuts through the waves, its hull full of chained bodies. Their names, their languages, their gods do not appear in the official logs, but their descendants live all around us today, in our music, our food, our words, in the way we move our hands when we speak. And yet, when people in the world say slavery in the Americas, whose story do they usually tell? They talk about plantations in the southern states of the United States, about cotton fields in Virginia and Mississippi, about the year 1619, as if that were the beginning of everything, as if America were only the North, as if Latin America and the Caribbean were side notes, a backdrop, a shadow. So tonight, let us tell the story from here, from the South, from the lands where Portuguese and Spanish, African languages, and indigenous tongues mixed into something new. Let us tell a story soaked in sugarcane and blood, rebellion and samba, saints and ancestors. Let us speak of a truth that is uncomfortable and yet necessary. Nowhere in the Americas was slavery mild. Nowhere. Slavery was not a misunderstanding, nor a soft paternal relationship between masters and servants. It was a system of terror that built the wealth of empires. But it was not the same everywhere, and the way race was imagined, imposed, and resisted changed from place to place, from century to century. To see that clearly, we have to shift the camera. We stop looking only from Washington or New York and start from Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Cartagena, and Veracruz. We listen not just to one story, but to many. Let us begin with something cold and hard, numbers. They are not everything, pero sí hablan. They speak. Historians estimate that across the whole era of the Atlantic slave trade, about 10.5 million enslaved Africans disembarked alive in the Americas between the year 1501 and the year 1866. Under this single Atlantic sky, that whole circle of pain you see on the screen is 10.5 million lives. And look at the dark wedge. Brazil alone received about 4.8 million souls, almost half of everyone torn from Africa and forced across the ocean. The thin slice for the lands of the future United States is tiny beside it. From the very beginning, the center of gravity of this horror was not the North. It was Latin America, put it another way. For every ship that landed in the region that would become the United States, Brazil received about 12. On the left, you see Brazil, about 4.8 million men, women, and children. On the right, the United States, only about 388,000. Brazil imported around 12 times more enslaved people than the United States. 12 times. 12 ships against one. 12 chains for every single chain in the North. And yet, by the middle of the 19th century, the picture twists like a knife. In the year 1872, Brazil's enslaved population was about 1.5 million people. In the year 1860, on the eve of the Civil War in the United States, there were close to 4 million people in bondage there. So look at the bars. Brazil, 1.5 million. The United States, about 4 million. Brazil brought in 12 times more people in chains. And still, the United States holds about 2.5 times more enslaved people by the mid-19th century. That is the moment where the numbers stop making sense unless we ask what kind of system could create this. Watch the lines cross. On the left, you see how many people were dragged in from Africa. Brazil high above, the United States far below. On the right, you see how many were still enslaved centuries later. Brazil drops down, the United States shoots up. Brazil's line falls from 4.8 million arrivals to 1.5 million still enslaved. The United States rises from 388,000 arrivals to about 4 million in chains. One line going down, the other going up. The south of our continent swallowing more people, yet leaving fewer alive in bondage. The north importing fewer people, yet multiplying its enslaved population from within? Part of the answer is simple, brutal arithmetic. In 17th century Brazil, especially in the sugar fields of the Northeast, enslaved men on those plantations rarely lived more than 7 or 8 years after arrival. The Portuguese preferred to work people literally to death and then replace them with new captives rather than allow a population to grow naturally. In Brazil, on average, 2 men were brought for every woman, a gender imbalance that made forming families difficult and kept birth rates low. Death and importation, a rhythm as relentless as machetes cutting cane under a burning tropical sun. In the United States, especially in the 19th century, the logic turned in another direction. The wombs of enslaved women became the engine of slavery's expansion. Children inherited their mother's status, generation after generation. So while Brazil fed the system with ships, the United States fed it with births. One system burned out bodies and called for more from across the ocean. The other turned the very fact of birth into a life sentence. Now look at it all together. Brazil, about 4.8 million people imported, about 1.5 million still enslaved by the year 1872. The United States, only about 388,000 people were imported, yet close to 4 million were enslaved by the year 1860. 12 times more people were brought to Brazil. About 2.5 times more people were enslaved in the United States by the middle of the 19th century. Under the same Atlantic stars, 2 slave systems wrote different equations with black lives. Neither was mild. One chewed people up and replaced them. The other trapped entire bloodlines and grew its wealth from their children. That is the arithmetic of terror beneath our hemisphere, and from our Latin vantage point, we refuse to let only one side of that story stand. Who tells the story? For a long time, even the way history was written tried to soften that reality. In the early 20th century, influential historians in the United States, like Ulrich Bonnell Phillips in his survey of American slavery from the year 1918, helped spread an image of slavery in the southern states as a harsh but benevolent paternalism. In this fantasy, enslaved people were supposedly given decent food and clothing, encouraged to form stable families, convert to Christianity, and live under the care of their owners. Novels and films like Gone with the Wind, released in 1939, engraved that myth into popular imagination. But even in the years between the First and the Second World Wars, black scholars were already tearing off that mask. Historians insisted on speaking about profit and cruelty, about the whips and auctions and non-consensual sex. Later, they described the forced separations of families, the ubiquity of sexual violence, and the near impossibility of legal emancipation. After the horrors of the Second World War, overt racism fell into disrepute in many places, and the fantasy of slavery as something kindly began to crumble. Yet a new distortion emerged. While scholars in the United States were correcting the record about the brutality of slavery in the southern states, some of them began to describe slavery in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, as milder, less critical, somehow softer. They looked south and saw Catholicism, mixed-race populations, and the possibility of manumission. They saw samba and feijoada and said, "See, it must have been easier there." It was not. Part of that illusion came from religion. The United States was a Protestant country in a hemisphere shaped mainly by Catholicism. In French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies, the Catholic Church influenced law and custom. Enslaved people sometimes had the right to marry and sometimes could buy their freedom. Compared with the rigid racial codes of the southern United States, that looked like mercy. Thinkers like the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire and the North American historian Frank Tannenbaum contributed to this image. Freire's famous book, The Masters and the Slaves, first published in 1933 and translated into English in 1946, went so far as to suggest that Brazil was almost free of racism, unlike the United States. That image charmed many post-war scholars in the North. But myths cannot hide blood forever. Over the past 5 decades, historians such as Florestan Fernandes and Abdias Nascimento dismantled this liberal fable of Brazil as a racial paradise. They showed what Black Brazilians knew from experience, that racism was real, deep, and deadly, even without written segregation laws. Still, because most of the university programs and publishers studying slavery are in the United States, because the North American university system is enormous and powerful, and because the civil rights movement became globally famous after the Second World War, the world often listens first to the stories that come from there. The Black populations of Latin America never had such a giant academic machine or a media empire dedicated to telling their history. During the Cold War, brutal military dictatorships many of them supported by the United States, ruled Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Chile. Under those regimes, anti-black racism could not even be denounced openly. There were no constitutional rights to freedom of speech that could protect black activists. Speak too loudly, and you might disappear into a prison cell. Meanwhile, the soft power of the United States flowed over our continent like a river of images. Films, series, and novels about slavery produced there became global references. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, and Alex Haley's Roots from 1976, along with the 1977 film and television adaptations, moved audiences all over the world, including Brazil and the rest of Latin America. Their stories matter, but we must not confuse visibility with totality. The plantation is not only in Georgia, it is in Pernambuco and Bahia, in Jamaica and Saint Domingue, in Cartagena and Veracruz. In the year 2019, 4 centuries after 1619, the world heard once again about that date, thanks to the 1619 Project, a series of essays in the New York Times Magazine led by journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. The project insisted that slavery stood at the very center of the history of the United States. It treated 1619 as a site of memory in the sense described by the French historian Pierre Nora, a point in time that accumulates symbolic weight for a community. For many African Americans, 1619 has long held that power, yet the project also made one especially controversial claim, that American colonists sought independence from Britain mainly to protect slavery. Hannah-Jones later withdrew that specific point from the edited book that came out of the project. Right-wing commentators attacked the project as if even naming slavery were treason, and the political climate became so polarized that any attempt to question the United States-centered framing was treated as an attempt to minimize slavery itself. Then, in the summer of 2020, when the murder of George Floyd sparked protests around the world, the year 1619 glowed once more, linked tightly to discussions of race in the United States. The project helped many people there reckon with how chattel slavery and anti-black racism shaped that country. And yet, in doing so, it also fed an old habit, the idea that the United States is the Americas and everything else is secondary. From our side of the hemisphere, we know that slavery did not begin in 1619, nor in Virginia, nor under the British flag. A century earlier, in the year 1521, enslaved people on a sugar estate on the island of La Española, today's Dominican Republic, rose in rebellion. 1 century before the famous date in the English colonies, black men and women were already fighting for their freedom on Latin American soil. Long before that, the Portuguese had already begun taking enslaved Africans to Europe. As early as the year 1444, captives arrived on the Iberian Peninsula, in what is now Portugal and Spain. By the time the first recorded group of enslaved Africans landed in Virginia in 1619, historians estimate that about 369,000 enslaved Africans had already disembarked in the Americas in various European colonies. Think about that. Before the story that so many textbooks call the beginning, almost as many African captives had already arrived elsewhere in the Americas as would ever arrive in the region that would become the United States across the entire history of the Atlantic trade. Even the first Africans in the territory that is now within the United States did not arrive under an English flag. As early as the year 1512, a free African man named Juan Garrido joined the expedition of the Spanish conquistador Ponce de Leon. He stepped onto these lands as part of the Spanish conquest, carrying with him a story that did not fit neatly into the black and white North and South frame that would later dominate. Where there is oppression, there is escape. Where a chain is locked, someone is already testing its strength. From the late 16th century onward, across many regions of the Americas, Africans and their descendants fled plantations and mines, forming communities of runaways. In Spanish territories, they were called palenques. In Portuguese lands, quilombos and mocambos. On maps drawn in European capitals, these settlements were small, inconvenient specks. In the memories of our people, they were sparks of sovereignty in a world built to deny it. In the year 1609, near Veracruz in present-day Mexico, a group of runaways formed a powerful palenque. For years, they defended themselves against Spanish soldiers. The crown wanted their bodies back in the cane fields, but the mountains offered cover, and the runaways knew the terrain better than any soldier. Around the year 1618, after repeated battles, this community negotiated something extraordinary. The Spanish authorities recognized their freedom and granted them land. The The settlement became known as San Lorenzo de los Negros, considered the first town of self-emancipated men and women in the Americas. Today, it bears the name of its leader, Yanga, but freedom came at a price. The people of San Lorenzo de los Negros had to agree to defend the coast of Veracruz against external attacks, and more painfully, to return future runaways to their enslavers. Even in victory, power forced them into compromise. Sovereignty, in a world built on slavery, was never pure. San Lorenzo de los Negros was not alone. About 35 miles from Cartagena, in present-day Colombia, another maroon community rose. Cartagena was one of the busiest slave trading ports in the Americas. Almost 200,000 enslaved Africans disembarked there, stepping into a world that wanted to devour them as labor. Outside the city, they built their own. Among the leaders of that community was a man known as Domingo Biohó, or Benkos Biohó, probably born on the Bijagos Islands of what is now Guinea-Bissau, whose men were famous as fierce warriors. Along with his family, he is believed to have escaped slavery around the year 1599. With other runaways, he helped found the palenque of San Basilio. The Spanish crown fought these Maroons for years. A treaty temporarily recognized their autonomy, but empires rarely tolerate black freedom for long. In the year 1621, the Spanish governor of Cartagena, Garcia Giron, ordered that Biohó be captured, hanged, and his body dismembered, its parts displayed as warnings to anyone who might dare to follow his footsteps. But memory is stubborn. Today, in the village of Palenque San Basilio, in the municipality of Majares, southeast of Cartagena, a statue shows Biohó breaking his chains. Children grow up walking past that monument. It tells them, we were enslaved, yes, but we were never only victims. We were warriors too. Travel now in your imagination to the northeast of Brazil, to the green hills that once were part of the Portuguese captaincy of Pernambuco, in what is now the state of Alagoas. In the early 17th century, this region saw the rise of Palmares, the largest and longest-lasting community of runaways in the Americas. By the 1640s, Palmares was already composed of 9 villages nestled among forests and hills. By the 1670s, some scholars estimate that as many as 30,000 men, women, and children lived there. 30,000 souls building a society from scraps and defiance. Portuguese settlers and later Dutch occupiers who controlled parts of northeastern Brazil between the years 1630 and 1654 launched repeated campaigns to destroy Palmares. Again and again they failed. The quilombos stood, its people fighting with knowledge of the terrain and desperation worth more than gold. Only in the year 1695 did colonial forces finally manage to destroy Palmares and murder its leader, Zumbi. His severed head was displayed in the city of Recife to crush hope. Instead, over centuries, Zumbi became a symbol. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Brazil has honored Zumbi as a national hero. Statues, schools, and public squares bear his name in cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia, and Salvador. Songs and films revive his story. The day of his assassination, the 20th of November, is commemorated as Black Consciousness Day. In the year 2023, Brazil established that date as a national holiday. Look at the irony. In a country that kept slavery legal until the late 19th century, the figure of a black rebel, a runaway, has become a national icon. In the United States, monuments honoring black people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, or leaders of revolts such as Denmark Vesey, are much more recent, dating mainly to the time of President Barack Obama, and are often concentrated in northern states. Legal segregation and the fact that black people are a numerical minority there have made it harder for rebels to be celebrated in bronze and stone. In Brazil, runaway communities were widespread, and today, people who identify as black and brown together form the majority. Zumbi's image, towering over city squares, tells us something about how resistance has been woven into national memory in different ways on each side of the hemisphere. Let us return to the ocean, that dark highway of bodies. Brazil, along with the British colony of Jamaica and the French colony of Saint-Domingue, built enormous sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. Those plantations, alongside fields of indigo, cotton, and coffee, gold and diamond mines, jerky meat factories, and shops in port cities like Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Recife, Kingston, Le Cap, and Port-au-Prince, were all powered by black labor. Why did Brazil, in particular, import so many enslaved Africans? Part of the answer lies on the African side of the Atlantic. Between the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Portuguese established colonies in west-central Africa, Luanda in the year 1575 and Benguela in the year 1617 in what is now Angola. These colonies became two of the most important ports of departure for enslaved Africans bound for the Americas, the first and third in volume. The majority of those captives were sent to Brazil. Two-thirds of these enslaved Africans were men, many of them captured in warfare and then sold into the Atlantic trade. From the beginning, this was a commerce in war captives turned into commodities. Geography also played its role in this crime. The distance between Rio de Janeiro, the largest slave trading port of the Americas, and Luanda or Benguela was shorter than the distance between many West African ports and the Caribbean or North American shores. Ocean currents in the southern hemisphere flow counterclockwise, creating a pattern that makes the South Atlantic crossing somewhat faster, though never safe or humane. Portuguese and Brazilian traders built what we might call a bilateral system. Ships left Brazil carrying goods such as alcohol and tobacco to West and West Central Africa, then returned to Brazil loaded with captive Africans. British and French traders, by contrast, used a triangular pattern. Ships left Europe carrying saleable commodities, traded them for human beings on the African coast, transported those captives to colonies in North America and the West Indies, then carried plantation products back to European ports. Because Brazil was directly connected to the main ports of embarkation in Africa, the rhythm of death and replacement on Brazilian plantations could be maintained more easily. Work people to exhaustion, import more. Sugar needed bodies, the ocean supplied them. If we walk through the streets of colonial Rio de Janeiro or Salvador now, we see another side of this story. In Brazil, many enslaved people lived in cities. In those urban spaces, black and brown people, whether enslaved, freed, or free, formed the majority of the population for the entire period of slavery. They worked as porters, street vendors, artisans, and domestic workers. Vast parts of urban life depended on them. Customs rooted in Roman law and shaped by Catholic ideas created more cracks in the system there than in the United States. Enslavers in Brazil could free their enslaved property relatively easily. To prohibit this, lawmakers would have needed to pass specific civil laws limiting the owner's power, and such laws were never adopted. In many cities, enslaved people could hire out their own labor, paying a daily fee to their owners and keeping the rest of their earnings. Over time, some managed to save enough to buy their own freedom. Historians have shown that manumission, the act of granting freedom, was especially common in Brazilian cities and more likely to favor women, children, and those born in Brazil. Many manumissions were not acts of generosity, but business deals. Enslaved women, in particular, bought their own freedom at market price. Their owners then used that money to purchase other enslaved people. The system bent, but it survived. In some cases, owners did emancipate enslaved people without payment. Often this occurred in their wills when they were old or ill. Influenced by Catholic beliefs, such acts were framed as gestures of gratitude intended to secure salvation. But even then, freedom was rarely immediate. It might be granted on condition that the enslaved person continue to serve until the owner's death. And many of these testaments reveal another uncomfortable truth. Owners used them to acknowledge and regulate relationships with enslaved women with whom they had fathered children, sometimes freeing both mother and child and leaving them property. The Catholic Church, in Brazil and in the French and Spanish colonies, did not especially encourage enslaved people to marry, but it allowed them to. Once a marriage was officially recognized, the Church opposed the separation of spouses, at least in principle. In practice, couples could still be separated, but this religious framework created one more argument that enslaved people and their allies could sometimes use. Perhaps the most striking difference with the United States, though, was this. In much of Latin America, enslaved people could marry free blacks and whites. Over time, such marriages increased the mixed-race population. Children and grandchildren of these unions could, in some cases, distance themselves from their black ancestors in terms of social identity. Why? Because race in Latin America has not been governed by the one-drop rule, the idea dominant in the United States that any person with one black ancestor is considered black. In countries like Brazil, the combination of physical features and social position has often mattered more than ancestry alone in deciding whether a person is seen as black, white, or somewhere in between. This did not mean the absence of racism, far from it. Racial segregation in Latin America was rarely written into law or enforced in the rigid way it was in the United States, but racism and deep inequality spread everywhere. In Brazil, mainly, racism has long functioned as a mixture of colorism and class prejudice. Light-skinned people of African descent who managed to rise socially could pass as white. Dark-skinned freed people who remained poor were classified as black. Recently, public debates about race, racism, and slavery's legacy in Brazil have encouraged more fair-skinned people of African descent to identify as black or brown. This is a new phenomenon, contrasting with the United States, where a person with any known African ancestry has generally been categorized as black or African American, regardless of class or skin tone. At the same time, more people in the United States are choosing to identify as biracial, refusing the simple black-white divide. Race, like history itself, is not a fixed essence. It is a story that societies tell, enforce, and sometimes change. To feel these differences in our bones, let us follow two women. The first is Francisca da Silva de Oliveira, known to history as Chica da Silva. She was born between the years 1731 and 1735 in the town of Tejuco, in the gold and diamond mining region of Minas Gerais, Brazil. Her mother was an enslaved African woman, her father a white man. In the early 1750s, inquisitors from the Holy Office visited Tejuco. Someone denounced Chica's owner for living in concubinage with her and another enslaved woman. The accusation was probably true. Soon after, Chica gave birth to a son. Her owner did not formally recognize the boy as his child, but he freed the baby immediately after his Catholic baptism. In his will, he went further, naming the child among his heirs. In 1753, the inquisitors returned and forced Chica's owner to sell her, scandalized by his open relationship. In her early 20s, Chica was sold to a Portuguese businessman and mine owner, João Fernandes de Oliveira, apparently because of her beauty. A few weeks later, on Christmas Day, João freed her. Chica and João continued to live together in comfort. They had 13 children. Although they were never legally married, when João eventually returned to Portugal to claim an inheritance, Chica stayed behind in the grand house they had shared, managing his properties, including dozens of enslaved people. Their children inherited assets, and the sons received university educations in Portugal. Chica, born enslaved and black in a mining town, became part of the Brazilian slave-owning elite. Now cross the continent and the ocean in your mind to the British colony of Virginia, in what would become the United States. There, in the year 1735, a woman named Elizabeth Hemings was born. Her mother was an enslaved African woman. Her father, a white man, gave her his surname, Hemings. Elizabeth belonged to John Wales, a plantation owner. John Wales later became the father of Martha Wales Skelton, who would marry Thomas Jefferson. After the deaths of his first, second, and third wives, John Wales had 6 children with Elizabeth Hemings. Despite this long relationship, he never freed her, even though the law of Virginia allowed slave owners to manumit enslaved people between the years 1782 and 1806. This period stretched until 1 year before her death. When John Wales died in 1773, his daughter Martha inherited Elizabeth and her 10 enslaved children. 6 of those children were Martha's own half-siblings. 3 of them were freed at some point. 3 remained enslaved. None of them received a university education. None of them inherited land or wealth as recognized heirs. Among Elizabeth's children was Sally Hemings, later described as a beautiful young woman with very light skin. When Martha married Thomas Jefferson, Sally became his property. Although some lingering doubt persists due to a lack of specific DNA evidence, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has come to regard it as a settled historical matter that Thomas Jefferson fathered a group of children with Sally Hemings. Like her mother, Sally had 6 children with a white owner. All 6 were legally his property. In his last years, Jefferson allowed his enslaved sons by Sally Hemings to leave bondage, but he never officially freed his enslaved daughters. None of these children was named as his heir. Unlike Chica, neither Sally nor her mother, Elizabeth, was ever emancipated during her lifetime, despite the law sometimes allowing it. This was not unique. Richard Mentor Johnson, who served as Vice President of the United States from the year 1837 to the year 1841, had a long relationship with an enslaved woman named Julia Ann Chin, often called his enslaved common-law wife. They had 2 children together. She, too, was never emancipated. There were slave owners in the United States who freed enslaved women with whom they had such relationships, but those cases were rarer and cannot be explained by a single cause. In Latin America, Catholic norms around marriage, legitimacy, and the salvation of the soul opened more doors, however narrow, for such acknowledgments. In Brazil, the story of Chica da Silva has become famous as an example of an enslaved woman who used small openings to enter a world not designed for her. These stories do not show that slavery was gentler in Brazil. They show that the brutal system took different shapes. Chica herself, once freed, became a woman who owned other enslaved people. Pain and privilege nested together in one life. So, what do we do with all this? We have seen that Brazil imported many more enslaved Africans than the United States, yet ended up with fewer enslaved people in the 19th century because death consumed lives faster than birth. We have walked through quilombos and palenques, through cities where black and brown faces filled the streets under chains and contracts. We have seen how Catholicism opened some possibilities for marriage and manumission, even as the church also blessed empires and baptized slave ships. We have watched histories being written, first by white scholars who tried to paint slavery as a benevolent institution in the United States, then by black scholars and others who exposed its cruelty. We have watched later authors describe Brazil as a racial paradise, only for that myth to be torn down by Brazilian thinkers like Florestan Fernandes and Abdias Nascimento. We have seen how the academic power and media influence of the United States turned its own story into the global story of slavery, while dictatorships and neglect silenced Latin American histories. We have followed the year 1619 from a quiet archival date to a contested symbol, thanks to the 1619 Project and the protests after the murder of George Floyd. We have recognized that while this project forced the United States to look into its own dark mirror, it also risked reinforcing the idea that the rest of the hemisphere is a mere audience to its drama. Against that, our perspective from Latin America says slavery and race have never been the same everywhere. Spain and Portugal had longer, more direct connections with Africa than Britain did. The bilateral trade between Brazil and West Central Africa, with ports like Luanda and Benguela, made Africa's presence in Latin America enormous and intimate. Tropical and subtropical agriculture, especially sugar and later coffee, created some of the deadliest conditions for enslaved labor on Earth. Cities offered room, just a little, for education, legal maneuvering, and manumission, especially in Brazil. Catholicism, with all its contradictions, gave enslaved people certain rights, like the possibility of marriage and self-purchase, that did not exist in the same way in the southern United States. At the same time, the absence of codified segregation laws in Latin America did not mean the absence of racial hierarchy. Instead, racism wore the masks of colorism and class. Lighter-skinned descendants of Africans were encouraged to deny their blackness, while darker-skinned people remained trapped in poverty and stigma. Today, Brazil has the largest population of African descent in the Americas, a living testament to how deeply Africa has shaped this part of the world. Race, we can now see, is not a scientific category. It is historical. It is formed in plantations and ports, in churches and courtrooms, in cafes and slums, changing from place to place and from era to era. The framework developed in the United States, the one-drop rule, the strict black-white divide, and the written codes of segregation are just one way the story has been told and enforced. It is not the only one, even within this hemisphere. Today, as nationalism spreads like an illness across the globe, and as far-right and white nationalist politicians and lawmakers in many countries attack the teaching of slavery, trying to make it seem distant or harmless, it becomes even more urgent to remember that slavery was foundational, not only for the United States, but for all of the Americas, from Canada to Chile, from the Caribbean islands to the Brazilian Sertão. From our Latin American vantage point, accepting the horrors does not mean drowning in them. It means also lifting the things our ancestors made despite chains, the drum rhythms and dances, the food that mixes indigenous, African, and European ingredients, the religions that hide African gods behind Catholic saints, the languages that twist colonizers' words into something new. Our philosophy is not detached. It comes from lived experience. It understands that truth always has a point of view. From the north, the story of slavery may begin in 1619 and revolve around plantations in Virginia. From here, we know the story is older, broader, and more tangled. It starts on La Española in 1521, in Palmares, in San Lorenzo de los Negros, in the streets of Salvador, and Cartagena, in the gold mines of Minas Gerais. So, as we sit around this imaginary fire under a darkened sky, listening to the waves that once carried ships full of chained bodies, let us hold two truths together. First, nowhere in the Americas was slavery a mild institution. It was terror, profit, and dehumanization, whether in a cotton field in the southern United States or a sugar mill in Bahia. Second, the ways that terror was organized, resisted, remembered, and disguised differed from place to place. The history of slavery in Latin America is not a footnote to the history of the United States. It is a central chapter in the story of the modern world. If we can recognize that, if we can look at this past without flinching, from all our perspectives, north and south, black and brown and white, then perhaps we can understand one another and ourselves a little better. In honoring not only the suffering, but also the strength, resilience, and creativity of those who came before us, we can make sure that the chains they broke are never reforged. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.